Can you guys hear me okay? Hello, hello, testing? Yeah? All right, I'm actually pretty loud, but they're recording, so I'm going to use this. Once in a while, if I put it down, can you still hear me? Yeah. Yes? Awesome. I specifically asked for this slot so I could keep you guys for another hour. No, I'm kidding. I actually come from New York, and I was late, so I had to switch for this slot. But I really appreciate all of you guys showing up. I know it's the last talk of the day, and I'll try to make it interesting and different. So my name is Nitya Narasimhan, and I'm going to be talking to you about material design from a developer perspective. So just for context, this was not the talk I was going to do. But almost everything I suggested had been done already. So I was like, great, I'm going to go to a developer conference and talk about design, because that's the one thing that I think they would not have known about. We'll see. So let's get started. Those are the hashtags. If you ever have any questions during the talk, feel free to tweet them at me or just hashtag them. If I don't get a chance to get around to it, I can answer them offline. But basically, my goal today was actually to talk to you about material design from the perspective of someone who has used it recently and kind of thought this would be interesting for developers to know. And I want to set this up by, can you read that? Okay, all right. So I would have done my job if when you leave this room, you can answer these three questions, right? The first one is, what is material design? The second one is, how do I use material design? Or how would I use it in my role, whatever my role may be? And the third, which is actually the most complicated one, is how do I justify this to my manager or client, right? Because every time you learn something new, there is a cost associated with implementing it. So can you tell me enough that I can go to someone and say, yes, we need to do material design today? Hopefully, I'll give you enough ammunition that you can do that. So first, a little bit about me. All those slides are available online, so don't worry if you can't read too well. A little bit about me. My background actually is in research. How many of you know Infosys? Okay, so I was actually employee 52 in Infosys. But that was a company in India that kind of worked with software, and I was doing stuff on the back end. Never had to look at UI. That was awesome. Then I went and did my PhD at UCSB, and my focus was on fault tolerance middleware. Again, didn't have to touch UI. I was perfectly happy. So I really didn't care too much about design. And then I went to work at Motorola, and I worked there for over a decade in the R&D department. And if you're familiar with Motorola, you know that they're probably one of the most iconic companies that knew about ubiquitous computing before ubiquitous computing was a thing. And what I mean is they worked in mobile because they had phones, they had tablets. They worked in TV because they made set-top boxes. They worked in automotive because they had an automotive division. They worked in wearables because they had an embedded systems division. And effectively, they were building devices, they had public safety, they were building all of these. So in research, our goal was to build the next generation of applications. And it's at that time that we realized user interface matters, because you are now talking to consumers. You need to give them something they can work with. It was also the first time I understood the value of this vision around seamless mobility, that as you go through all these environments, your application really needs to kind of interact with the environment and update or adapt itself to the context of what the user wants to do there. So that was my background. And then this is what I do now. All of those hats are things I wear. But effectively, at a very high level, I kind of left research behind and started getting more and more into development. I've consulted in full stack on all those technologies. I've taught Android at schools. But currently, I'm the VP of engineering at a startup building product on social mobile web. And I run a whole bunch of meetups, the Google Developer Group in New York, the Google Developer Group in Hudson Valley, and Meteor Hudson Valley. I'm also the Woman Tech Maker lead. But enough about me. So now you know about me, I want to kind of get a sense about you. How many of you here consider yourself designers? All right. How many of you consider yourself developers? How many of you consider yourself entrepreneurs? All hands need to go up for this one. So the case I was trying to make here is that you and me are not very dissimilar, because what's happening these days is that increasingly we're seeing there's no longer this clear role anymore. Designers want to know enough development that they can build their own stuff. And developers want to know enough design so they can build a prototype that doesn't embarrass them, right? And the reason both of them want to do this is they want to be in the middle. They want to be able to kind of like become entrepreneurs and do something with the ideas they have. And so what I'm going to say is that we've all been here, right? No matter whatever your role is, you've probably at some point asked this question, how can I get to MVP? Do you know what MVP is? Minimum viable product, right? Minimum viable product is like the technology that every entrepreneur will say, just enough to show the functionality. Let's not waste time building everything, but enough to take it to my customer and convince him that he needs to buy this, right? So why am I talking about this? As developers or designers, when you talk MVP, you face challenges in the environment today. So I tried my best to color code these slides. I don't know if it'll make a difference, but usually when you see purple, it's like a developer thing. If you see orange, it's going to be a designer thing. Hopefully you can see it. But the challenges you face are different. The developer, when he comes into the environment today, he's basically going to say, holy cow, there are so many platforms. I need to have my app work with iOS devices and Android devices and web. That's his concern. The designer, on the other hand, is kind of like, oh my God, there are so many form factors. I have to work with phones and wearables and TV. I've taken all this time to come up with this beautiful UI that works on a phone, and then someone puts it on a gigantic TV, and it looks horrible, right? So we each have our concerns in the space. So what happens is we ask these questions. The designer says, hey, how can I adapt my design to suit the context of usage as the user goes across different devices? The entrepreneur part of you, that hat that you wear, is going to say, how do I preserve my branding? If I'm going to build an app and put it across all these platforms, I want the user to be able to recognize that it's my app on every one of those platforms. But at the same time, so I want this uniform branding, but at the same time, I want it to be unique enough that my competitors lose out, right? So that's the concern of an entrepreneur. And developers, our concern is actually really simple. We're like, how are you going to manage this thing, right? If I've got like 50 different devices and so many code bases, how do I build code where I have reuse and the code base is maintainable? That's my only headache. All of us wear more and more of all these hats now. No one can kind of say, oh, this is not my problem, I'm going to punt it, right? And I'm here to argue that material design can help. So far, is everyone with me? Am I going too fast? Yes, success. I apparently you talk slowly. No, I'm kidding. I want to argue that material design can help. And if you take one thing away from here, you have to think that this is the value proposition of material design to these two communities. To a designer, material design gives you new affordances and guidelines. I'm sorry you can't possibly read that gray text, but it says that it was informed by extensive studies of design in the wild. In other words, hey, you as a designer, guess what? You actually had 1 million Googlers, not 1 million, but quite a few hundred perhaps, who went and did all the spade work. They looked at all the environments, looked at how design is done today, did a study, and abstracted that out into guidelines for you. Someone did your work for you, so all you have to do is like kind of live off of it, right? So that's a good thing. From a developer perspective, the value proposition is the minute the design spec came out, everyone built toolkits. You have resources, so you don't have to start from ground zero. You can reuse components that were built by other people that adhere to this design. So here's the thing. Can I actually play this? Let me see. Is that how I play it? Or maybe I have to do it here. Most of you have probably seen material design in action, but let's see if we can kind of really quickly. How many of you are familiar with the term material design? OK, so we maybe don't even have to look at this, but really I want you to focus on a few things that you'll see here when you kind of look at material design. One is the colors. The other is the fact that there seems to be a lot of motion. And the third is that you have this notion of shadows and surfaces, right? So we're going to dive into that. It was 48 seconds when I checked, and it's still going. All right, I'm going to believe that you know material design. Let's move on to the next slide, yeah? So now I want to kind of say, OK, so what is material design? There are two things, two parts to it. The first is it's a visual language. So here we're not talking implementation, we're talking specification, right? And this is for the designer. There's a lot of extensive spec stuff. If you go read the spec, make sure you have a whole weekend, lots of caffeine, and you can get through it. But if you really start, I'm a developer, I'm not a designer. So it was kind of like I was challenging myself to give this talk because I'm like, designers are going to so hate me. But what happens is, as a developer, when you start reading, you're like, oh my God, there's so much thought that went into this. This is fascinating. So that spec is really immense. The other thing, the other side of material design is it gives you a unified experience. The specification specifically tries to figure out how all this design can be adapted to work at different device sizes and for different requirements, right? And we'll talk a little bit about that as we move on. So breaking it down, if someone comes up to you and says, hey, can you tell me something about material design? Remember these 4 words and you'll kind of like impress them. So there are 4 things, 4 terms, okay? The first one is tangible surfaces. And we're going to look at each one really briefly. But the first thing basically looks at how you actually model that stuff, like the thing on which you paint your interfaces. The second one is about graphic design. We'll talk about that too. Third says meaningful motion, and the last one says adaptive UI. So the first one, we're looking at, what was the first one, anybody? Yes, the win, all right. Tangible surfaces. So tangible surfaces basically says that think of material as the metaphor. The whole of material design is informed by their study of paper and ink. And what that means is when you look at this, can you guys actually see this? Right? What's really beautiful about it is you can actually see that there are various parts to this interface, right? And if you take away 2 things about what this means, the first one is that in material design, you model your interface as objects in 3D space. Every object occupies space, it has elevation, and it has edges. And we'll look at that in a second. The other side of it is that once you have this, because they're objects in 3D space, you have surfaces and shadows. And these are used to give the user hints about, how is this app structured and how will it behave when you do something with it. So the fact that that button is looks like it's floating over everything is actually a hint to you that, hey, if I scroll underneath, this thing is going to stay. Everything else will move. So, oh my God, can you see that? This was one of my favorite images. Can you guys hear me if I talk without this? Oh, no, okay. All right, if it echoes, let me know. I want you to look at this really quickly and try to map what you see on the left to the right. You see this little yellow button, it's over there. You see that blue bar, it's over here, and in the middle is this card. And what you're really looking at is when I said that in material design, objects have properties, every piece of your design has a seam, elevation, and solidity. When you look at this, you can immediately tell the relationship between those objects. If you look at this, it all looks like one page, looks flat, right? When you look at that, you suddenly realize, wait, this button is above everything else. And this guy is higher than the card, right? And that immediately gives you an understanding of what motion will be. What do you think is going to happen when I scroll this? It'll go under the top, because you can see that that blue thing is higher, so you know it's going to go under the top. And what do you think is going to happen to that button? It's higher than this and this. It's going to stay, right? So this to me was like my eye-opener as a developer. I was like, oh my God, this is so awesome. So I'm going to give you something that was even more awesome. This is all the components laid out on that grid. I really love this image in the spec. Because if you know material design, there are a ton of components that you can use to compose your app. And this literally tells you how they all relate to each other in that hierarchy. And remember I talked about properties? The other side of material design is behaviors. So shadows, motion, and visibility. Shadows means if I'm higher than you, I'm going to cast my shadow on you. So using shadows kind of lets the user intuitively guess which items are floating above other things. Motion. If all things are on the same level, they will move together, right? So that's why cards will move together. But if there is a seam and I have a space, it's possible I can have one thing move without the other. Visibility. This was the thing that was like, they'll say 10 times, things are solid. You have to think like this is like real material. Meaning that for every how many of you in your pre-development design life have built a design where you have little things that don't show up when you build your first UI and you're like, I'm just going to jack the Z index until it shows up. You don't care 2 hoots. You're like, I just want it to appear, so I'm going to jack it up. How many have done that? First person. And then you realize down the line that you wrecked everything else because this thing won't go away. It's in front of everyone. Visibility basically says these elements are solid. So if you've got one guy and another guy below him, there's no way he can come up through it. And what I'm trying to get at is that I like this because it means I don't have to think about it. Someone did all this thinking, and they've put those properties into the components themselves. So far, so good? Yes. All right. So that was surfaces. So when you think about surfaces, you want to think about that's how, like the paper and ink paradigm, that's how I lay out my design. The second part of material design is the graphic part. And they talk about it in terms of these things, right? The first is you want bold colors and imagery. The one thing when you see material designed apps is they grab you, like they're really colorful. We'll look at that in a second. The second is this notion of intentional space. Third is typography. And the fourth is baseline grids. And really, this was inspired a lot by print. I mean, how many of you read books? I haven't finished the question yet. I mean, how many of you read books as paper books versus Kindles? Yes. You know, you miss that, right? You miss the beauty of like some of the things. If you've ever seen one of the old Bibles or the old books where they have like elaborate calligraphy, it's like, wow, this is awesome. We miss that. And I think this is a way of thinking about the fact that design has to transition from that physical print medium into this digital medium, and how do you do that? So let's look at a few examples here. The first one, if you can look at it, this was what Gmail looked like before, and this is Gmail redesigned with material design. And I kind of want you to look at a few differences, right? Do you see that there's more white space? And that immediately kind of gives you the sense of how things are separated. You understand their items. Whereas here, can you tell the difference between the header and the list items? They kind of all run together. The other is the color. Like bold colors are branding. Here, I couldn't tell the difference between who owns this. There, I can pick a primary color. Netflix, how many of you have, I do, how many of you have 3-year-old kids who can pick Netflix out of a block of application icons because it's bright red? So color means something, that bold, visceral reaction. You can do that by using that for your primary base. And the third thing is, you can also see that they designed it to have different colors for the buttons. So you like, the minute you look at that side, you understand what they're trying to get you to do, right? They're basically saying, hey, you want to click that and do something here? Here, you wouldn't know. You wouldn't even have a clue how to go about composing a message, right? So this is what material design does for you in terms of, you know, the guidelines for intentional space. Color. Very simple rules. There's a primary color and accent color. Your primary color is the color of your surface. Like in general, you know, whatever your basic UI is going to be, there's a primary color for that. That's ideally the color that you use for your branding. And then there's an accent color, and the accent color is supposed to draw your eye to the most important thing you want the user to do on that side, right? So it's a great way for you to like, and you really want, and they have real simple guidelines to pick colors that really stand out against each other. Again, they take the decision out of your hands, so as developers, we don't have to think about this. And finally, there's this notion of themes. So here, each one of those is about, on a per component level, what's the primary color, what's the accent color. A theme basically knits it all together. It says across this whole family of components, this is what I want you to enforce. How many of you have used Bootstrap? Familiar with themes, right? Yes? Okay. Typography, again, like so my whole goal was to talk about it from a developer perspective. This literally lays out very clearly two things. One is they came up with a font called Roboto that will render beautifully and clearly across all screen sizes. So you don't have to worry if your stuff is going to be shown on a watch or a TV. You know people can read it. The second is they gave a ton of usage examples for a developer. So it's like, oh, okay, here are all the various font sizes that we recommend. And we'll give you an example of what's the best font size to use in that kind of a component. So in a sense, as a developer like me who doesn't understand design, I can actually go to some of these examples and say, oh, I'm doing a list, and here's a list. And oh, that's what I want to do. These are the kinds of fonts I'm going to use, right? So my kind of thinking is that as developers, we kind of want to know enough about these guidelines so we can implement them, but not necessarily worry about what they mean. Meaningful motion. So there are two kinds of things I highlighted here. So motion in material design is about keeping the user engaged, but also making him understand that there was intent behind what he did. So there are two kinds of things we're seeing here. Transitions, can you guys see that there was a little image, and then when you click on it, it expands out, fills the screen? So you as a developer, if you want the user to go from screen A to screen B, you can identify some element that's in common with both and use a transition effect. You can just literally tell it, here's a transition effect. There's a component in the first screen, and here's a component in the second screen. I want you to go from there to there with this transition. And what it does is, to the user, it gives him this impression that this is a nice, easy, flowing app, right? It kind of like feel like, yes, I'm still immersed in this. It's not this jarring effect of like fireworks go off and suddenly something shows up. It's like, it's gradual. The other thing is that how many of you have heard of ripples? The ripple effect. So the main value for ripple effects is you want the user to understand that it was his intent, like his action that kind of triggered that, right? So there's a radial effect. So wherever the user presses a button, you'll see kind of like a radial ripple extend. It gives a really quick and dirty visual cue. Hey, you pressed this, and guess what? Something happened. It like keeps you engaged. I did this, right? So the nice thing about these are all of these are tools that should go into our tool belt, meaning that we can add ripples to components. It's just a mix-in style thing. We should think about transitions when we look at places where you're taking the user from one interaction flow to the other. Rather than kind of treat it as two different things, we want to gradually move him over. And this one was, can you even see this? I hope you can. So meaningful motion, it's the idea is it should be deliberate. And again, I want to emphasize that all of these things they've done for us, we don't think about them. But I really liked this. Can you kind of see that the green thing moves at a constant pace, but the orange thing scoots up and then slows down, right? So the idea with deliberate motion is that you want to give this user the sense that you did something and we're on it for you. We're like running, we're going to get it done, and then you slow down and ease into the end, right? Versus the other case where you're like, yes, I'm going to go at whatever rate I want. But I'm making this up. Ideally, what it means is that they've actually studied the idea or the usage of motion and kind of seen how you can engage the user and what he's doing. The last part, so we've talked about tangible surfaces, we've talked about graphic design, we've talked about meaningful motion, and this is the part that most of us are probably most familiar with, which is adaptive UI. And if you're familiar with Bootstrap, you kind of know the grid system already, right? Most of you know that in Bootstrap, you can kind of like use grids to kind of figure out how to break your interfaces to make them flow on various screen sizes. Material design has the same kind of philosophy, and they have various tags that kind of like adapt to the screen sizes for the devices that you're thinking about. So all of this, and like this is a really nice table. If you get a chance to go look at the spec, you'll go and see that for every device in the market, like in mobile, they actually tell you what the metrics are for all the various pieces of, like the margins and the font size and all that stuff. So if you kind of want to look it up and try to do it yourself, I just found that interesting. But this is what I like. So adaptive UI has two parts. One is that when you write your app, you want to basically make sure that you use those breakpoints to know how it flows across different devices. But they also give you really simple patterns that you can use to force that adaptation to behave in a way that makes sense. So in this one, there's a reveal pattern. So you can see that on this side, when you click that, that thing drops down, right? Can you see that? Kind of? Right, if you ever go check the slides out later, click on that link and you'll see it. I didn't realize it would be so faded out. So one pattern, how do you make this adapt? When you go from a small screen, you're showing a menu. When you go to a bigger screen, you just reveal it. So the same interface on both devices. In this side, it adapts to the fact you have a small screen size, and that side, it adapts to the fact you have a bigger screen size. So one pattern you use is reveal, right? Make sense? Okay. Another pattern is transform. You're like, oh, on this device, I can show things in a vertical order. On that, I have more layout space, so I'm going to transform it into a tab. So that's a transform effect, right? So you can kind of think of that. Where does that suit my pattern? Third is reflow. So you can see that here, everything is linear. And this is what we're most familiar with in the web domain. There, it kind of says, oh, OK, I can recognize that perhaps this content has the most items. I'm going to give it the whole length and reflow it. And divide, do I have to explain divide? So divide basically says, when I know that I have more real estate, I can split it up, and perhaps this could be like the detail view and the list view. I can take up that extra space and use it for something else. So what does this really mean for developers? So let's talk implementation. How many of you here are mobile developers? How many of you are web? How many of you are Polymer people? Angular? React? No, React. Oh, OK, good. And what's the other one? What did we talk about? Android. OK, so those are 4 I have here. Anyone else use any other web framework I haven't talked about? Meteor? One over here. Ember and Backbone? There is one, all right. So let's talk implementation. So I wanted to there's a lot of stuff out there, so I just wanted to give you a sense of some things that you should start looking at. So let's talk about color, right? Like in material design, there's this idea of I need a primary color and an accent color. So how as I as a developer who knows nothing about design, sorry? Right, and tones within them. So what can I do to really quickly get up to speed on color? We actually have tools for that. How many of you heard about the palette library in Android? Yes, so you know that what you can do in Android is if you have an image, it can actually extract the primary colors from that, and you can apply that as the branding. So you can literally see that in here. This one adapts to the predominant color in each image, which is pretty cool. It makes it look magical. The other one is for the web. If you kind of look at, how many of you know about Material Design Lite? No? All right, we'll look at that in a second. But that's basically color. It's a color wheel. You pick a primary color. It'll automatically drop out every other color that won't go well with it as an accent. So you're limiting your choices. In other words, for people like us who don't want to think about it, it takes away the choices that are bad, so you can pick the right ones. But I really wanted to kind of talk about, now if I understand the principles of material design and I want to use it in my particular product, what do I do? So if you can read this, on the x-axis it's mobile versus web. On the y, it's Google versus everyone else. So I want a quick show of hands, just to see how many of you know all of this stuff, right? How many of you know about the Android Design Support Library? Okay, how many of you know about Material Design Lite? Yes. Polymer and paper elements? Angular material? Material UI? Materialized CSS? Okay, so I'm kind of quickly going to talk about these and then walk through some of these examples. On the right side, we have the Android Design Support Library. So if you want to do material design in Android, you effectively can go to that to get a set of standard components that you can literally use as is. And one of the things that is important about that is it's actually backwards compatible all the way to V-level API 7, I think, Froyo. So which means that there is no excuse for you not to go material on even the oldest app that you've built. And if we can, we'll look at some of those examples. On this side, material design, so on first, of course, is Polymer. How many of you know what Polymer is? Okay, so Polymer is a web components platform, and in my opinion, is the future of the web. I'm very biased towards Polymer. But one of the beautiful things about it is that they have paper elements, which is a library of polymerized components for all material design stuff. So you can get toolbars, you can get cards, you can get image holders, whatever you like, right? And it's as simple as putting that element in your HTML. Since most of you are not familiar with this, in addition to this, this targets Google's strategy in the web. That targets Google's strategy in mobile. But this thing here, if you go to getmdl.io, is effectively Google's lightweight version of a material design toolkit for vanilla JS, meaning any framework that uses HTML, JavaScript, right? And you just want to implement it. So it gives you CSS and JavaScript simple components that you can use, and they're evolving it. The very first version gives you things like cards and nav bars, but it also does something really, really useful. If any of you want to do an MVP, they give you standard, ready-to-go templates, like complete app templates, layouts with components that you can throw together and very quickly bind to your data to get an up-and-running application that looks really rich. And the kinds of templates they have are for a blog, for your typical app with a nav bar, for something that's text-heavy. So you can look at those. On the website, Angular Material effectively takes material design and makes it available as Angular directives. If you're familiar with React, React also has a component model. So Material UI is the library that gives you React components that implement material design. And my other option, if you're looking at vanilla JS, that is you're not using any of these frameworks, but you want to use material design in the web, Materialized CSS is like a highly popular library that comes from Carnegie Mellon. And it kind of competes with MDL, but MDL is very new and comes from Google. This has been around for a while. So if you use things like Meteor, people have already packaged this up for that, and it's the kind of the easiest way for you to start. So someone told me that I need to breathe every so often, so I'm going to slow down for a second, because apparently I talk too fast. All right. So can someone tell me how much time I have? All right. When are we supposed to be done, do you know? We have 15 minutes. OK, we're going to go rapidly through this so that then you can ask me questions, all right? First one, I wanted to give you examples of toolkits for the various things. For those of you not familiar with it, paper elements and Polymer. Polymer is Google's platform for web components. It effectively has two different things. It implements polyfills for the web component standard. Then it has syntactic sugar through extra, helpful utilities that you can use to make it simple for you to use web components in your web app. They have lots of catalogs of elements. Paper is their catalog of material design elements. So what you would do is, if you look at this, can you see something which says paper card? Effectively, that is a web component for creating a card element. You could use that directly in your HTML. Make sure you can use Bower to install the dependencies for this. And using that creates this for you with very little additional code, right? One of the nice things about this is, like, if you're familiar with the web component model, is that most of these things are built by third parties, and they're available in a repository. You can use them and just compose your applications on the fly. These are all done by Google, so you're going to have a lot of rich attributes that you can use to bind to come up with all, like, customized things for colors and fonts and things like that. This is Material Design Lite. So you can see the difference between Polymer and Material Design Lite. There, you kind of literally had a named element called card, and it gave you that card. Here you're seeing the div soup, right? But there is no dependency on any framework. So the same card, if you wanted to build it in MDL Lite, this is what you have. You have your CSS classes, and you have your HTML. So if you use something like Meteor, and you want to basically use this, you would make this part of your template, and then you would be able to have the styles bound to it and just inject your data, right? Materialized CSS, if you don't want to use the Google version, which is actually kind of not complete right now and evolving, materialized CSS is really good. For example, all the links, if you go to them, you can actually see them in action. This is a card style where if you click on this, it'll actually flip it around. It'll slide up, use motion to show you details, and then slide back down. This entire thing is done with that CSS, with that HTML code and CSS classes. Again, something that you can very quickly bind into a template in something like Meteor or Backbone and use them. This is my favorite. I'm like nowadays very much a React fan. So when we talked about Polymer, we talked about web components. React is from Facebook and kind of brings a component model, but they have a lot of interesting tricks. They have a virtual DOM. They kind of like figure out on the fly what the diffs are and make it really efficient. But if you really have to think about it, React is just the view in your MVC. They don't take any kind of like, they don't enforce anything about data bindings or controls. They literally say, here's how you render the view. You come up with how you want to bind the data. So it really fits into a lot of different frameworks. Material UI is the most popular material design toolkit for React components, and it's fairly comprehensive. So you can look at it over here, and you can see it looks very similar to Polymer because you can actually see elements with the names on them, right? And what it does on the fly is when you kind of use that component, all right, we won't talk React. We'll talk React. If anyone wants to talk React, come talk to me offline. But what's really nice about this is it's very readable. You can go in there, use this in your code, and you know exactly how and where you're binding the various data values to your card, right? Angular UI, Angular Material is just Angular's version of it, so I'm not going to go into that. And I kind of want to take a few minutes to talk about Android. So a lot of stuff has come out for the Android platform recently. This was like the Android support, like the very first talk that kind of talked about what are the components that are being supported in Android. So they have a whole list of like, I think, nav bars. They have the floating action button. All of those have been transported to that. But if you have here's all of them. If you have an interest in more of these, I'm going to leave it at this. So just last week at DroidCon in New York City, the Android UI team talked about what's new in Android engineering. And if you actually go check out that talk, you'll really see like they've made great strides. There's a lot more new stuff that's come in. So you can do things like create light status bars. They have palette updates. So previously, you remember when I was talking about color and material design, you could extract color from an image and use it to create your primary and accent colors. They've got updates that let you actually pick that color from a subsection of the image rather than the whole image. They have things that let you actually filter, like if there are 5 different colors in the image, which one do I want to pick, like, rather than have it pick it on its own. And then, how many of you have seen Android experiments? Yes, this is a really, really good site. So if you are interested in building a materially themed app, go check this out, because not only do they have really good applications, like seriously production quality ones, but most of them have source code. So if you really want to understand what are the patterns for which people kind of are building these apps, you can kind of get the source code from that and look at them. And for those of you who are familiar with Chrome experiments, there's a similar one that will show you web apps. There's also the showcase the material design team themselves have. And this kind of, I think, has Android apps for now, but you can go and check out some of the Chrome apps as well. And finally, for those of you who think this is interesting, and this is one of the reasons why I talked about it, I got interested in this, Google's working with Udacity. They have a free course that basically talks about material design in depth. It's run by the Google design team. And if you go through this, like I think 5 lessons, you get a really, really good sense of what it means to kind of develop and design using material design, but it focuses on Android. And that's about it. Am I on time? All right, go ahead. Yes. Yes. Yes, so I'm actually going to say, if anyone has resources, please post them to me. I'll update this. Yeah. But the thing I want to point out is like there's actually different kinds of tools we can get for web versus Android. So are you talking about web or Android? Okay. So in the web space, if you go to MDL Lite, you only get the picking of colors. But if you go to the material design palette side, you can get the whole thing. So what you're saying is you can actually go and pick a color scheme. So you can say, here's my primary and here's my accent. It actually gives you a whole palette. Not just 2 colors, but about 6, I think. 5? Okay. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, I actually, so as a developer was doing this, have you heard of Lavish Bootstrap? Back in the day when I was doing Bootstrap stuff, you go to the site called Lavish Bootstrap, and you basically upload an image, and it'll extract the colors and give you the theme. So I think that they're trying to do that. But yeah, resources are always useful. But the MDL Lite, I actually initially was going to talk mostly about Material Design Lite. MDL Lite is really, really cool because you can pick those 2 colors, and it actually auto-generates a CSS file for you. And the CSS file is actually based on the names of those colors, so you can even figure out what it is without going through the color wheel. So yeah. Any other questions? Oh, yes. Yes. Okay. You can, the links up there are there. If you actually go to g.co/materials showcase, you'll get to that link. Yeah. This is not this is like the material design showcase. The one before the Android experiments has code. This one just showcases the apps. Yes. So this one, if you just search for Android experiments, or if you go look at these slides later, they're all linked in. How many of you know Roman Nurik? Like, he's the design advocate at Google. He's built a couple of really, really beautiful apps. One of them was this music app that'll kind of get wallpapers and things like that. All of those are open sourced. So you can actually go in here and, I mean, you're probably like me in the sense that when you learn something, you pretty much start by taking someone who's built what you like and you hack it. So this is a great way for you to like find really, really good apps and hack them and then make them look like yours. Sorry. Yes. Yes. All right. Remember, he asked, so if I'm here for the next hour, it's his fault. So let me tell you why I did this talk, right? I did this talk because I wanted to like do something that wasn't there, but also because I consulted and I'm in product, right? I build product. I actually started, so I work in Meteor in the product that I'm doing, and I first started by using MDL Lite, like the Material Design Lite from Google. And the reason I used it was very simple. It was the maximum flexibility, and I knew that the guidelines were going to adhere to their stuff. But then I stopped because it didn't give me all the things I wanted. They're still building it out. It gives you basic cards, and it gives you some layouts. But I found that, so if you ever go to a hackathon, I'd say go with MDL Lite, because it'll give you the whole app structure, the templates, everything's really quick and easy to put together. But once I picked the framework of my choice, right, I'm using Meteor and React, I like Materialized CSS. Because in a sense, it has the richest toolkit, and it lets me pretty much kind of forget about event handling for some of the components that I want, so I've been using that. I haven't done much stuff in Android yet, but Android is the one place where you really don't have to worry about choices because there is only one, right? So I'm not really concerned about that. But in the web space, my heart is with Polymer, but the reason that I don't use Polymer right now is if you've kind of been following the whole Polymer story, it's at 1.0, right? And most of the paper elements were built for 0.5, and they're being migrated a little bit at a time. So you can get some of the elements, but not all. So I'm kind of like, OK, I'll wait. So when I'm thinking MVP, I want to really be able to put something quickly out there to a user so that I don't embarrass myself. But they should be able to see the functionality very clearly. And 90% of our applications, whether we like it or not, tend to be list detail views, lots of image cards, and occasionally menus, right? So those things, pretty much all of them have it, but Materialized CSS worked really well for us. Yes? Oh, which one? This one? Oh, really? All right. I'll fix it. Yes. So you're asking why not Material? I mean, why not Bootstrap? It's a right. Oh yeah, I mean, so the whole idea, remember I was talking about colors and all that? So there are 3 things you really want to think about when you customize, right? One is, there is a notion of a theme. Like, so let's say these are the dominant brand colors, and you want to be able to do that. So that's part of their kind of basic language. So you pick your color scheme, if you will, and across all the different devices when you're building your apps, you basically can enforce that. from the degree of customizability, it depends on your platform. If you're looking at web, at the end, it's still CSS. They give you a base that you can work off of, but in the stuff that we do, what we do is we basically derive from that and then kind of customize the little parts. But you really, unless you're very good at like the design or you understand it, at least personally, I don't touch things like changing the actual behavior. So I'm not going to take away the ripple effect from a button or anything like that. I kind of let that be, and the only things that I customize are the selections of the fonts that I use for the various sections, selection of colors that I do, and to some extent, how many components, like what kinds of layouts do I want. And even in that, that's the one nice thing about Material Design Lite is they gave me example layouts that I can start with. Whereas with all the others, like one of the reasons Bootstrap took off is they gave you so many examples, so you kind of can think about what your primary page should look like and pick something. I don't think Material Design is there yet, but among those packages that I've looked at, MDL Lite has it. The others don't, not as much. I hope that answered it. Okay, questions? No? Everyone wants to go home? Cool. All right. So if you can, please do give me feedback. You can see the tags are on every one of those. Because it's the first time I did this talk, and I really want to refine it for other people. And at the same time, if you find any resources, please let me know. I'll update them on this, and I'll give the link off to the organizers so they can post it there. And thank you.